our hypothesis was that carprofen would be able to be administered both orally and subcutaneously into marmosets, and that we would reach appropriate pharmacokinetic levels in marmosets.
Welcome to The Last Word, the official AALAS podcast dedicated to connecting and informing the laboratory animal science community. Each episode takes a closer look at recent articles published in our journals, JLAS and LAS Pro, and features interviews with professionals advancing the field. I'm Jennifer Smith, your host. As a laboratory animal veterinarian and the Director of Education and Scientific Affairs at AALAS, I look forward to sharing these conversations with you. Let's discover something new together. Hello and welcome. Today in this episode, I am joined by Dr. Ekaterina Perminov, DVM. Dr. Perminov, or Kat, obtained her DVM from Western University of Health Sciences and completed her residency training from the Salk Institute for Biological Studies. She's now a clinical veterinarian at UC Irvine and recently published a paper in JLAS titled Pharmacokinetics of Oral and Subcutaneous Carprofen in Common Marmosets. So hello, Kat. I am so glad that you're here for a lot of reasons. It's always fun to meet a new friend. I cannot wait to talk about this paper. And I'm also secretly really excited to talk about the common marmoset, which has probably become now my favorite lab animal species. So for all those reasons, welcome for being here. And why don't you go ahead and tell the listeners a little bit about yourself?
Sure. Well, thank you for having me on your podcast, and I've actually listened to a couple of the other ones as well, so it's exciting to be invited on. So a little bit about me. As you mentioned, I did my veterinary school education at Western University of Health Sciences. I was actually interested in being a vet since I was a kid, as many veterinarians are. And I, in particular, got interested in lab animal medicine in my undergrad at UCI, which is where I actually currently work at right now. And at UCI, I got involved in a lab studying regenerative medicine in axolotls. And that is what was the most pivotal experience for me that sparked my interest in lab animal medicine. I really liked the idea of working with a interesting species like the axolotl, which I absolutely still love. I know it's kind of the hype right now, axolotls are, but yeah, they are very cute little animals. And so because of that, I wanted to go into laboratory animal medicine post graduation from vet school. And so during vet school, I also got a lot of other lab animal related experiences. And then after graduating, I also did a small animal rotating internship also in Irvine. So I was very lucky to stay local. And then, as you mentioned, I was fortunate to match into a lab animal medicine residency at the Salk down in San Diego, also somewhat local. And I was actually their first resident. And that is where I completed my paper, which you mentioned, looking at the pharmacokinetics of carprofen in marmosets. And yeah, now I'm back at UCI working as a clinical veterinarian at my alma mater.
Oh, I love that. Okay, so I'm going to unpack this for a second. You might be the first guest on this podcast who was drawn into lab animal medicine by the axolotl. So that is awesome. That is a good thing. That's really cool. Very cool. That's also another species I've never got to work with. So that is exciting. And I'm so excited to hear that you were the first resident at Salk. Oh, that is fantastic. You have a great program there. And I know you're going to introduce the team and tell us who did what, but that's exciting to know your first one. I'm sure they're quite proud of you. So why don't we go ahead and do that? Go ahead and introduce the team. Let us know who did what and why sort of you guys decided to take on this project.
So the team that I worked with, one of the important people was the attending veterinarian and the director at the Salk, Trinka Adamson, who's also on the paper. She actually also did pharmacokinetics during her residency as well. So I'm sure that kind of had a little bit of an impact on my decision.
Sure.
Yeah, she was great to work with. She still is great to chat to and work with as well. And so at the Salk, I also worked really closely with one of the marmoset research labs. And they focused on developing a transgenic marmoset model to study Alzheimer's disease. And so I was very heavily involved in that lab. And marmosets, I don't know if you've ever looked up a picture of one. They are adorable. They have these cute little tufts by their heads. They're pretty small. They're New World primates. They're very curious little animals. They love marshmallows. So yeah, that is definitely another reason, I guess, that I wanted to work with them and I got to work with them. And that's where my interest, because of the research that they do, I wanted to improve on the animal welfare. And obviously an important component of that is being able to provide them appropriate analgesia. And so that's kind of where my study came in. And so also around that same time that we started working on developing the paper, there were other pharmacokinetic studies being published in marmosets, specifically on opioids, buprenorphine, and so. But there was very little published pharmacokinetic data on nonsteroidal anti-inflammatory drugs, NSAIDs, like carprofen, in marmosets. And so there was also this really great paper by Anna Goodrow in ILAR, which included carprofen dosing, but there was no pharmacokinetic data. And so that led into us deciding to pursue this study. And our team kind of saw a need to get it done and get that information out there. And so it took, I would say, maybe about 6 months overall from the beginning to the end to get all of it.
That is so great. I loved all of that. And I really just, again, shout out to the team at Salk. What a great project to have for a resident and what great people to work with that you have there. We know Trinket well, big fan. How exciting for all of you to come together to do this project. And we have to talk about one of the best lines in your paper where you describe the common marmoset as biomedical supermodel. And that, I just love it. I have that highlighted right here. And I love your imagery of how cute marmosets are. But also your introduction did a great job of describing how important they are, historically for research, but how right now, very important. And we're seeing a ton of really great papers coming through JAALAS involving the marmosets. So this is a really exciting time for that species. So biomedical supermodel or not, we're excited to talk about it with you. All right. So tell us a little bit more about the marmoset, and especially we'd love to really know what your hypothesis of the study was.
Sure. I'm so glad you want to hear more about them because they really are.
I do.
They're really fun to work with. And as you mentioned, that section in the paper, I really do believe they are the biomedical supermodel. And so they have become increasingly popular in research, and the publications in them has tripled in the last 20, 25 years. And they are easy to breed in the lab. They have short gestations and often twin, and they have diverse research applications. Again, as I mentioned before, Alzheimer's is one of them, but other neurosciences as well. They also are commonly used in infectious research. And again, that paper from Erika Sasaki, who actually was one of the first ones to develop the transgenic marmosets, highlights how great of a model they are. And because of that, obviously, it's important to provide them the right type of analgesia. And so we saw the need and see a need, fill a need. And so we wanted to validate and optimize the analgesic protocols for them, just because there's been very little pharmacokinetic data on NSAIDs in marmosets. And the NSAID that we wanted to look at is carprofen, and it works by inhibiting cyclooxygenase enzymes. And our hypothesis was that carprofen would be able to be administered both orally and subcutaneously into marmosets, and that we would reach appropriate pharmacokinetic levels in marmosets. But I don't want to jump to the conclusion too much. That was the surprising finding of our paper, is that it did not. And I guess it's good that we were able to do this study and see exactly what came about it.
I love that. And I do appreciate you giving us that spoiler alert as well. But it's good to know. We always ask, kind of like, hey, what was the hypothesis? And yeah, we'll cut to the chase as far as the end result. But we're going to talk a lot more before we get there to more of the study. So let's jump into that, I guess. Tell us a little bit about the study design, especially, it's unique. You have, only so many marmosets that you can use, and you did a really nice job describing that. It would be good for you to unpack that for our listeners.
Sure. So we did use a crossover design, and we had 3 adult marmosets, Rafiki, Opal, and Lucero. Those were their names. I don't know if that's appropriate for me to say, but they all had very different personalities as well. And so we were able to use this crossover design because marmosets are an important animal research model. And so we wanted to refine the strategy in developing the study. And so each animal basically received carprofen at our 2 hypothesized doses of the 2 mg per kg and 4 mg per kg, which is commonly published in literature. But again, there's no pharmacokinetic data on that. And we administered it either orally or subcutaneously with appropriate washout periods afterwards. The animals were acclimated to the handling and restraint procedures beforehand to minimize stress. And the process was that we collected blood at various time points, specifically at hours 0, 1, 2, 4, 6, 12, and 24. Obviously, the dosing was given after the 0-hour time point. And we used the saphenous vein on the back of the calf to get blood from the marmoset. And as you mentioned, how the marmosets are a biomedical supermodel, but part of the process was when we were collecting blood from the saphenous vein, the marmosets were kind of clinging on to the transfer cage, and then their back would kind of be stretched out to look like they were flying little Superman. It was very cute.
That's cute.
Yeah. And they would obviously get positive reinforcement afterwards. Yeah, I got really attached to these marmosets, obviously, as expected. And so then we collected blood for the plasma, we spun it down, and then we analyzed those via LCMS, mass spec, and using one of Salk's core facilities with the help of one of our mass spec specialists, Antonio Duarte.
Great. Oh, and I appreciate you giving that shout out too, because we know it takes a lot to get a paper like this to the finish line. So thanks for spelling that out. And thanks for doing a great job with your study design. It just helps us really see what was going on, minus the little capes for the supermodels. That's a good visual there that you gave us. All right. So it sounds like study goes off. You do what you need to do. Let's talk about the results. What did you find?
Yeah, and what we actually found was surprising, I suppose, but we found out that neither the 2 mg per kg or the 4 mg per kg by either route achieved appropriate plasma concentrations at or above the expected therapeutic threshold. And so that was surprising because a lot of other institutions use those 2 mg per kg or 4 mg per kg oral or subcutaneously administered doses. And so that was kind of a negative result. And at first I was frustrated by it, but it was still important to get that out there. And we did have another unexpected event occur during that study period. And that was that 2 marmosets that weren't part of that PK trial had received carprofen at 2 mg per kg subcutaneously during routine physical exams. And that carprofen was given because we were placing microchips for identification purposes. And what was interesting is that those 2 marmosets developed acute carprofen toxicity. And this was confirmed because we obviously performed blood work and submitted tissues, and all of it was consistent with an NSAID toxicity.
Yeah, so I appreciate you giving us that sideline highlight, which was unfortunate as well, but I did really appreciate how your group tied that into the, just sort of general welfare concerns for building a study like this and validation of why you chose the doses that you chose and, chose not to get into a higher dose, which might have been interesting from a PK standpoint scientifically, but not so interesting to have more toxicity occur for your species. So I really appreciated you including that and appreciated that anecdotal information for the study.
What was also interesting is that those 2 animals that did experience the acute carprofen toxicity, they were related. So again, it would have been more interesting to follow up and see if there was any sort of differences in the glucuronidation pathway, similar to kind of what's been reported for cats and for ferrets. But that definitely would have been another interesting topic to explore more. But because of refinement purposes, we only elected to utilize the 3 marmosets in that crossover study. But that definitely could be something to follow up on.
For sure. So let's jump into your discussion because you had a lot of really good points in there and we'd love to hear about those. And then we always want to hear, what did you self-identify as far as limitations for the study and sort of talk about those as well.
Sure. So obviously we found out that the standard carprofen dosages that we tested would not be sufficient to reach appropriate plasma levels. Again, there wasn't a limitation that we only had 3 animals, so it would have been nice to have more animals, but we also didn't want to test out any higher dosages as well, just because of those acute toxicities that happened in the 2 animals that were not enrolled in the study. And so that definitely was a point of discussion as well, just because right now there has been more publications on how carprofen dosaging is not appropriate for some of the laboratory animal species that we have and we use, particularly with mice. There's lots of other research being done right now that shows how higher dosages are needed to reach appropriate analgesic levels. So lately, there's been studies showing that 20 to 25 mg per kg is required, and even up to 50 mg per kg. But you also have to balance it out with the potential side effects. And so that's kind of what we saw in our animals as well. We obviously did not do any sort of histopathology for the animals that were actually enrolled in the study, but we did see the adverse events in 2 other marmosets. So that would be something to definitely take away, to be very cautious while administering carprofen at even the published dosages in marmosets, just because we don't know how marmosets are metabolizing those drugs. And so definitely more studies need to be done to assess appropriate multimodal analgesia in marmosets, whether it's looking at other COX inhibitors or the combinations of opioids and NSAIDs, things like that. It definitely was a point of discussion in our paper. And another important thing that we did find, I guess it was kind of minor, but I know that there has been publications on side effects with the administration of buprenorphine and skin reactions. And we did have some mild dermatitis. We obviously didn't do any sort of histopathology on those tissues, again, because of refinement purposes. And so that definitely would have been something else that we could have looked at. I know I'm talking a lot about how negative this paper is. And at the time, it was very exciting to do it. Yeah. And I just feel like there definitely could be more investigation into analgesic therapies in marmosets, 100%.
It's time for a quick break to hear about the AALAS Learning Library. Hey, are you ready to elevate your team's knowledge and skills in laboratory animal science? Well, the AALAS Learning Library is your one-stop solution for comprehensive training. With courses designed for everyone, you can train your entire team in one place, earn valuable AALAS CEUs and RACE CE credits, and take advantage of group discounts to maximize that investment. Getting started is easy too. Sign up for free to access select courses instantly to explore a vast library of resources. Empower your team, stay ahead of the field, and grow with the AALAS Learning Library, your trusted resource for laboratory animal science professionals. We so appreciate you just, being so transparent with your research because, sometimes that's hard to do. And you've tackled a big project here. And so I think just being able to say like, okay, this is a place in the sand. We've done this. And now next steps would be this, this, and this, I think is so important. It doesn't devalue the work at all. In fact, I would argue it makes it more valuable. Let's talk about those skin lesions a little bit. I like the picture in the paper. Thought that was really helpful for somebody who doesn't work with marmosets every day. How concerning is that?
I would say somewhat concerning. It was unexpected. I would say just because we typically did not shave the area of injection in the marmosets after giving carprofen regularly. For the study, though, we did decide to shave the area where the sub-Q injections were being administered. And what was interesting is that we did see that 4 of the 6 subcutaneously injected doses developed this red focal, not raised lesion at the injection site. And so it was definitely unexpected just because I know that sometimes marmosets will scratch at their backs, but I did not observe them scratching at their back after being injected. And so it was just kind of a odd finding of them having dermatitis at that location. And so it would have been, again, nice to get a histopathology sample to see what kind of changes were going on at the cellular level. But again, we did not get to do that. And it definitely could be another point of exploration, just because I know that there are lots of papers on the reactions that sustained release buprenorphine has in macaques and in pigs and so forth. So yeah, I'm not sure if others have seen this as well. I feel like most people do not typically shave when they give sub-Q injections of carprofen. So it was definitely interesting to find.
Oh, absolutely. And I think probably people listening now, their wheels are spinning like, we should probably look and see if that's also going on, underneath, the hair if it's shaved. So I'm just so glad that you sort of talked through that with us as well, because I think that was a really interesting sort of finding as well. And I liked also that you talked about the multimodal, because of course, with PK studies, it's great. What you did and contributed is fantastic here. And it would be so interesting now to take the next step and see how does that look when you've got something else on board, like an opiate. And so I'm glad to hear you sort of discuss that as well. And I'm sure that multimodal is what people are kind of thinking. And could you give less of the NSAID then and perhaps mitigate some of these potentially negative effects?
Yeah, for sure. I feel like most of the time when we are working with research animals and providing them with an analgesic protocol, it should be multimodal, especially when the pain becomes more than mild. And so I feel like most of the research that we do with marmosets, with primates, the research does cause more than mild pain. And so it is important for us as laboratory animal practitioners is to provide them with that multimodal analgesia as part of animal welfare and obviously regulations and so forth. So,
Sure. Well, thanks for that. All right. So we're getting near the end, which makes me sad because I really would like to talk about these biomedical supermodels all day. But we always ask our guests one sort of final question. If you've listened to the podcast, it's not hard to guess what yours is going to be. We would like to know what advice you would give somebody, knowing what you know now about this particular NSAID, carprofen, and marmosets. Like, what advice would you give to somebody who calls you up and says, hey, we want to give carprofen to our marmosets too, either straight away or hopefully as part of a multimodal approach? What advice would you give them?
As you mentioned, I think the takeaway is pretty straightforward, is that you should be very cautious while using carprofen and marmosets. They are very sensitive little creatures. I feel like they do get stressed out pretty easily. And so obviously make sure to monitor them closely after giving the carprofen, and to also provide them with appropriate supportive care, such as hydration, and potentially looking at other multimodal analgesia approach, maybe gabapentin, local anesthetics. I know that there hasn't been any publications in other NSAIDs in marmosets, which I'm very sad about. I do wish that other institutions would look into the pharmacokinetics of other NSAIDs in marmosets. So let's say like maybe meloxicam, or there's the cat one, Onsior. And so I do feel like marmosets metabolize things so much quicker, which may make them a little bit more susceptible to the adverse effects of them. And so my primary takeaway is to be very careful while using carprofen in marmosets.
Oh, that's great. All right. So we're kind of near the end. I don't want to sign off until I make sure. Is there anything else you feel like you want to add, or anything that you want to add to any part of this?
Yeah, I definitely would like to highlight again just that additional research really needs to be done looking into carprofen metabolism and pharmacokinetics, because again, there's so much new research being done and being published right now looking at carprofen and how the dosages that we previously thought were effective, but we are actually finding out that they are not. Again, there has been an incisional model in mice where they looked at very high dosages. And so they really highlight about being able to balance out the high dosages that are needed for carprofen in order to reach appropriate analgesic levels versus the side effects, the renal, the liver, the gastric side effects that carprofen can cause in those species, which again, we did see with those two marmosets inadvertently got acute carprofen toxicity. And so that's really about it, I would say, is that the research needs to continue to determine the appropriate dosage that is needed. And obviously, it is important to confirm all of the dosages, not just through pharmacokinetic data, but also through confirming the analgesic efficacy through things like Hargreaves and hot plate and all of those other analgesic parameters, that they're actually being provided appropriate analgesics, not just through the pharmacokinetic data.
Oh, I'm so glad that you brought that up. And I'm so thankful that you guys were willing to take this on. And it certainly does make you wonder about some of the doses and how effective those are without having that pharmacokinetic data. So, as a follow-up question here, just a little curveball, if you could kind of just talk through how difficult was setting up a PK study. It can sound pretty daunting when you're, maybe you're new or you've got an idea, but you're not quite sure. Any advice for someone to, reach out to a mentor, or sort of what would you say to help somebody really take on a project to get this PK data?
I definitely would recommend reaching out to somebody who is a mentor. Again, thankfully, I was able to reach out to Trinka Adamson, who was the veterinarian and director there. And so she had previously done a pharmacokinetic data as well. It was a little bit difficult for me since, again, I was the first resident. At most of the residency, I was the only resident as well. Thankfully, again, I was able to reach out to another resident over at UCSD, which I know you mentioned that UCSD often collaborates with Salk, which we do. And so thankfully, I was able to reach out to other resident mates at UCSD, even though they weren't part of my residency program. And also getting the support from the team, the vet services team was also very helpful. Lab members from the marmoset lab, Kofen Lee's lab, were also extremely helpful in setting up the study and analyzing some of the data as well. I definitely could not have done it on my own, for sure. Vet services team was absolutely phenomenal because you needed to have an extra hand there while the blood was being drawn, while the marmosets were stretched out in their little Superman pose, so to speak. And so it was really funny because I just basically created this schedule and an Excel sheet, which I shared with the vet services team and also with members of the Kofen Lee team as well. And that was very helpful just to kind of organize everything, just because there's so many moving parts. You wouldn't think that there are, but there definitely are. You have to keep a track of the samples and make sure that they go into the freezer right away, and then getting those samples to be analyzed again by the mass specialist, Antonio. It really, you have to plan it out. And I'm a little bit obsessive about trying to plan things out in advance, but you really have to just maybe put things into the calendar and then record everything, including the weights, the amount of fluids that they drink. We had to keep an eye on that. We had to keep an eye on just the food that they would eat in their transport cage. So that was definitely a process. And so those 6 months flew by just because I had my head basically just getting everything needed. And then what was the hardest part, obviously, was analyzing the actual data, which took a lot longer. And so my recommendation would be to not sit on that data and actually start writing things into trying to get it published and so forth. And so I definitely do not recommend waiting on that. Even if you do have it written down, you want to transfer it over into a Word document, really, because that's one of the hardest parts, I would say, is trying to recall back information. So ideally, you want to have everything down once you get it, if that makes sense.
Oh, it does. There you have it, you guys. I mean, this is, when people are listening and saying I want to do something like this, but I don't know how. Now you've heard it from someone who went from, I'm not sure how to do this, to obviously partnering with amazing people that poured into you and helped. And it's exciting to see the fruits of this labor. And I think more exciting too for listeners, who maybe are just starting out to see, yeah, I can do this. I need to reach out for help, but I could do it. And the end result, of course, is amazing because you're answering these really big questions that we need to know, right? You need to know if that drug works. You need to know if that dose is solid. And we need people like you to keep pecking away at this data. So thank you so much for taking that on.
I really do hope there are other residents that are hoping to get first author publications in order to be board eligible, do take on these additional pharmacokinetic analgesic studies, just because, again, as I mentioned before, more work needs to be done, whether it's in marmosets or in other species. I mean, even currently where I'm at right now, my brain is constantly churning. I just don't really have the opportunity to get to it, of looking at the pharmacokinetics of various species that are out there and that we work with, just because we have absolutely no idea that if the published dosages are actually appropriate. And again, it's not just the pharmacokinetic data, but it's also looking at the analgesic efficacy in those species as well. And you name it, it could be right now we're working with degus. And so I'm constantly wondering, is the dosage that we are providing them, is it appropriate? And so again, I feel like residents, it's a great opportunity. I know it's daunting at first and a little bit scary, but once you get it into motion, I feel like the ball kind of starts rolling, and then you really do have to dedicate the time to, again, I had to wake up and be there at 6 a.m. and then stay 12 hours plus some every single day. And it was just nonstop. But then once you get it done, you're like, whew. And then you're like, oh, look at that. I found something. This is exciting, maybe a little bit unexpected. But then, yeah, you get to further the process of the research that we're doing and also help the animals that we are working with, which is essentially one of the main purposes that I would like to think that I became a lab animal veterinarian, but I'm hoping that other residents are in the same headspace as well.
Oh, that is the best summary I have heard in probably ever on this podcast. So thank you. I really love it. I love everything that you're doing, and how you just jumped into it and wrapped your arms around it. And I think your organization bent towards organization probably helped a little bit there, but I really do appreciate you taking these things on, and we need more cats out there to take on things like this, because we do want to have that confidence in what we're giving our lab animal species. So thank you so much. Thanks for being here. Thanks for taking on this big project. And I have a feeling we're going to be seeing and hearing more from you. So I look forward to that.
I hope so. I feel like once you get a little bit of a taste of research, actually doing your own primary research, it is exciting. And then you kind of want to do more. I know sometimes it's painful. I feel like the actual collection was not that bad, but the writing is what is difficult. And that kind of makes me put into perspective the work that the researchers are doing as well. But I feel like that gives me more motivation to kind of provide for the research animals, because again, the researchers we kind of work in collaboration.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And what great perspective. I love that. All right. Well, that's it for today. Thank you so much for being here again. And we hope to hear more from you.
Thank you.
Thanks for joining us on this episode of The Last Word. We'd love to hear your thoughts, so be sure to leave your feedback in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe for more great content. We encourage you to submit your research manuscripts to our journals, AALAS and LAS Pro. We're always looking to feature impactful studies. You can also connect with us on our social media channels or email us directly at info@aalas.org. We appreciate your listening today, and we'll see you next time on The Last Word, an AALAS podcast. Until then, stay curious and stay connected.